Hello, welcome to our third video for data analysis in Google Sheets. This is an exciting video because we're going to start working with actual research questions based on the data that we've been working with so far. The first research question that we want to consider is as follows. Is there an association between the gender of a participant and the method they use when shopping for apparel products? The first step in working with a research question like this is to identify which variables, or which columns of our dataset, are involved in answering the question. Here we're looking for an association between two things, the gender of a participant and the method they use when shopping for apparel products. These two things are the variables or the columns of interest in our particular exploration of research question 1. We can highlight them. The reported gender of a participant is just the answer to one of our questions, so this is going to appear, as we mentioned before, as a column of our data set. When we talk about the method used when shopping for apparel products, we're talking about, does this person typically shop in a brick and mortar shop? Does this person use an app? Does this person shop online? And so at this point, what we want to do is start going over to our data set and figuring out which columns we're going to use for this comparison. Now that we're looking at our data, we can see which columns we're going to use. Question number 3, what is your gender, is going to be our first variable. And then if we scroll over a little bit, this time looking at the answers, we can see that question 9 answers the question of how do people typically shop for apparel. Brick and mortar shop, through my desktop, laptop, smartphone, etc. So the two variables of interest in this case are going to be question 3 and question 9. Now when we're making a comparison, what we're going to do is use a pivot table. We created one in the last video, but just to review, I'm going to show you how to create one again. Remember, our first step is to select all of the data. Even though we're just using columns 3 and columns 9, we want to select everything so that we have all options. You can use your Command A, or you could use your Command Shift and move to the right and then all the way down if you want. Remember, we go to the Data tab, click on Pivot Table, and it's going to generate a new pivot table. Now from the last video, we saw that by adding things to the rows and adding things to the columns, we fill out the headings, and then we choose what you could call an aggregator, or we choose the values that we want to place inside of the table. In our case, we know for a research question, we're interested in the answers to question 3 and question 9. So what we're going to do is add question 3 to our rows, and we're going to add question 9 to our columns. So at this point, we still haven't added values to the inside of our table. So all we see are the different possible answers for our question 3 and question 9. Question 9 is a little hard to see. If you wanted to, you could open up these columns, but then you're going to start having trouble seeing the actual entries. We'll work with this in a little bit. So what we want to do is add values to the inside of the table. So when we're exploring this particular research question, what we want to do is think about how many people were participating in our survey were female and said that they shop in a physical brick and mortar location. And how many people were, let's say, male and said that they shop online through the desktop or laptop. So what we're fundamentally thinking about doing is filling in this table with counts broken up by these two characteristics. What was their reported gender, and what was the method that they prefer to shop? So what we're going to do is go to our values and add just the answer to either one of our questions. You could do what is your gender, you could do when shopping for apparel products, where do you prefer to shop most of the time? It doesn't matter which one you choose. The important thing is that we use count A as our function to summarize these. And what we're going to end up with are the counts broken up by the two different responses for our two different variables. Now that we have our information aggregated using a pivot table, or in other words, we've looked at unique counts for pairings of possible answers, female with shopping in a physical shop, male with shopping online, we can start to look for trends between these two questions or between these two research variables. Keep in mind what these counts represent. For example, this particular 2, since it's in the male row, refers to the number of participants who identified as male, and their answer to the question, where do you prefer to shop? They said, I shop through my smartphone on the brand's mobile site. Right? With the table, sometimes it's hard to see trends. So oftentimes when doing research, it's best to take your pivot table and create some sort of visual so you can start to get a feel for what the relationship between the two variables might be. The easiest way to do this in Google Sheets is to highlight the part of your pivot table that you want to plot into some sort of chart. Now make sure you keep both your row headings and your column headings in this. You do not need to select your grand total because you don't need this to appear inside of your chart. Going up to Insert, there's a button inside there called Chart, and if you click this, Google Sheets is going to look at the data you're feeding in and make its best guess for what kind of chart would be appropriate. Its choices are actually pretty good, so usually the default chart that it suggests to you is a good one to start with. So if we do this on our data, I'm going to move this down so I can see both the pivot table and the plot. What you can see is on the x-axis, it's broken up by the participant's answer in terms of gender. So we have all the female responses, all the male, and all the other responses grouped. This is something called a grouped bar plot. And then we've color-coded the type of answer according to their answer to question 9. So for example, the blue bars are the counts of people who prefer to shop at a physical store. The green bar is the count of people who have preferred to shop on a smartphone through the brand's mobile site, etc. One of the things you may notice about this visualization is the bars are very tall for female, less tall for male, and then pretty small for other. The reason for this is that this visualization is built off of raw counts. And if you notice looking across in your pivot table, the different answers are not broken up evenly. In other words, most of the participants in our survey identified as female, and then the next biggest group was male, and then other, etc. So since there's more people answering female, when you look at the actual counts, you're going to get taller bars. Now, if we just want to think about percentages in terms of each one of these gender identifications, we can actually change our pivot table, and our plot is going to automatically update as well. So if rather than saying, well, 32 participants identified as female shops in a physical place, if I want to say what percentage of females answered I shop in a physical place, and what percentage of females said I shop online through my desktop laptop, we can just make one small change inside of our pivot table. Clicking inside the pivot table so that our pivot table editor shows up, right? If you're outside the pivot table, it disappears. We can go back down to the values, right? We're trying to change what happens inside the pivot table. We still want to use count A, but we're going to change the default way of showing this. So if you click Show As, we have 4 different options. Default, which is raw counts. We can look at percent of row. So this is going to take each individual count for female and divide it by the grand total for the row. So it's going to represent this 32 as a percentage of all female respondents. And then, for example, the 11 would be a percentage divided by 21 of all male respondents, etc. So we're going to change our pivot table into displaying percent of row. And you'll notice that our plot automatically updates, okay? So what we can see now is that for the females, we can look at the percentages. The heights of the bars are now percentages for females among the different possible methods they can use to shop. And it looks like shopping in a physical store versus online through a desktop are about evenly matched, a little over 40%. Again, the exact numbers are in your pivot table. And the less popular is our green answer, which is using a smartphone, the brand's mobile site. For males, it appears that the physical store is more popular than the other options, with red being a second place. And then for those that identified as other, the physical store again is most popular. So we can start to see the relationship between our two variables. How did the person identify their gender, and where do they prefer to shop? Now, the last thing I want to do in this video is just show you some good shopkeeping techniques. One thing that you'll notice is that this picture is a little bit hard to see. It's kind of small. We're trying to cram it in with the pivot table. So one thing you can do is you can move this chart to its own sheet. And I think this is really nice just for your own visualizations and just so you can start to see trends a little bit better. Anytime you need to edit your chart, you can click on the triple dot and you have an edit chart option. What we want to do is move our chart to the own sheet. So we're going to go down to the second to last option. What this does is it automatically opens up a new sheet inside of the Google Sheet you're working in, and it has a very large version of your chart. Okay? This is the same thing as the smaller copy, but it's sort of zoomed out. It's easier to work with. The last thing that you should do, because the pivot table and the chart are closely linked, if I change something in the pivot table, it'll automatically update on this chart as well. So we want to make sure that now that we have this research question explored and visualized, we don't want to allow people to make changes. So let's rename both our chart and our pivot table so it specifically refers to research question 1. So I might call this research Q1, and then I'll do PV for pivot table below. And then I'll do this as research Q1, and I'll do chart to represent it as a chart. Right? Now we know this pivot table and this chart are exploring a very specific question, and if we want to do a different exploration, we're going to make a new pivot table and we're going to generate a new chart, etc. But again, if you change anything on this pivot table, for example, if I change this back to default counts, or maybe I decide to do what are the percentages of columns, that's going to change the chart on the other sheet. So you want to make sure once you have everything the way you want it, rename both your plot and your pivot table so that people know not to touch it moving forward.